A lot of new parents end up with what they think is a temporary parallel life.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I'll do what I need to do and you do what you need to do. And at some point we'll find the bridge and then we'll cross the bridge and we'll meet again.
Right.
But sometimes that doesn't happen because a baby will need all this time, but then a toddler needs time, and then a child, and then you usually by then it's 2, 3, 4, and it's never ending. So the commitment is important pre-transition to say, look, we're going to try and commit to some of these things that are useful for both of us.
Today we're going to talk about holistic psychology, and I'm joined in the studio by Devika Mankani, who is a certified holistic psychologist.
So I'm a licensed psychologist.
And a licensed psychologist.
Right, yeah.
Okay, well, there you go. I'm learning new things about you already.
Same thing.
Yeah. So this is interesting because I feel like, excuse my ignorance, but I feel like I have no idea what holistic psychology is. And I feel like, how is it different than, your usual or conventional psychology?
Right. Well, don't feel ignorant because it is. I think it's an evolving field within the mental health space. I wouldn't say it's new. So 20 years ago, I qualified as a humanistic psychologist.
Okay.
And I'll explain that a little bit more. But holistic psychology is more of a perspective that you would add to existing modalities and existing fields in psychology. It's not either or. So holistic psychology doesn't exist instead of clinical psych or developmental psych or the other fields in psychology, but it's a perspective that you add on.
Okay.
And the definition will vary, right? But the definition that I like the most is a way to live in alignment, even if it's through your struggles.
Okay.
And even to use the struggles to find your alignment. Right? So you could have a mental health piece. So you have for example, a clinical psychology diagnosis, right? And very experienced clinicians working with you through your diagnosis on what to do. With humanistic and holistic psychology, we just kind of shift the lens a little bit around to what are some of the bigger questions that we can look at within this diagnosis or within this experience that you're having.
Okay.
Right? So, I'll give you an example of some of the questions that we use when we say, what does it mean to live in alignment? What does it mean to...
I was just going to say, what does that mean? Yeah.
To find purpose and meaning, because a lot of the research has confirmed that depression and anxiety has roots obviously in stress. I think that's well established. But also, if you go a little bit deeper and you just keep peeling back layers and layers, you find that a lot of the time it's connected to a lack of purpose or a lack of meaning.
Okay.
And that's ironic these days because we're so busy and we're just running and doing so much. But at the end of the day, when you ask yourself, did I contribute in some way? Right. So I guess in a way that's part of holistic psychology, and you kind of weave it into the clinical work or the marriage and family therapy to try and add a different perspective or a different layer, a different lens to deal with the situation as it is. So, it's maybe it's a way of saying, okay, is it 360? Perhaps. It doesn't deny the clinical aspects of an experience, but it kind of zooms out a little bit sometimes and looks at things like, who am I? What do I want? Sometimes, even to ask, well, where did I come from? And how does that inform who I am right now? How do I define meaningful relationships? So, questions like that, sort of soul questions that are definitely not one session answers.
Yeah, of course.
But that we sometimes go into a very long process of trying to uncover what that might mean.
Right. So it's great that you mentioned that and that you explained it, because I thought, okay, it's just a whole different aspect of psychology, but really it's just a different approach, or it's an additional approach?
I'd say it's an additional approach.
Okay.
It's an additional approach.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I like that because it digs deeper, and I think a lot of things that affect us as adults or later on in life might have root causes, like our childhood or a traumatic experience that we've been through, that we don't actually give that much attention to. Like we actually think, oh, but that was years ago, so it's fine. And when we dig deeper, we find out that no, actually, it's probably the reason why I have anxiety or I'm stressed. Okay, so that question of finding my purpose, I've had so many people come to me and say, because we spoke about that in a show earlier with another psychologist, and they were like, you know what? That is the most frustrating statement or sentence that I hear, because they feel like, okay, well, how am I supposed to find my purpose? Like, when you tell me, find your purpose, how do I do that? Like, how do I listen to my body or my soul and to find that purpose? And they find it so frustrating because they feel like, I'm never going to find it, or I don't know how to do that.
I love it. That's a big question,
yes.
right? And I usually flip it a little bit, or I tweak it a little bit. I TikTokify it, and that's what we were talking about. I'm not on TikTok yet, yes. But what I mean is I shrink that a little bit to what can I identify with as a purpose right now.
Okay.
Right? Because I don't think I can predict how my purpose will evolve in a decade. Mm-hmm. Definitely wasn't what it was 15 years ago or 20 years ago. I had a different purpose. So I guess, there is that, what is your entire life's purpose? Okay. And I think that's a pretty big question to answer, and it's one that involves a lot of predictions that you don't necessarily, that we're not equipped to make, right? So let's simplify it and break it down and say, well, what is your purpose right now? Right. Okay. I mean, one of the things that I'm speaking for you, I probably shouldn't, is that you've decided that you want to use your voice, mm-hmm. right, to share information and knowledge, which will make people's lives better.
Right.
And that's what you're doing in here right now. Okay. Right? And in this period of your life. So how about we just start with that, right? Okay. And that has roots in values, right? Values are usually more constant, mm-hmm. But the manifestation of those values can change, and that's how you would define your purpose in this space and time, right? Without saying, well, for the next 3 months, this is, unless you know that you're working on something for a limited amount of time. But usually it's just, and I think that's where the holistic and the humanistic approach comes in, and it can be helpful because it's a way of just saying, meet me where I am right now. Mm-hmm. Right now, I'm identifying with this. Mm-hmm. Right now, I see that this works. Mm-hmm. Right now, this is what sort of lights my fire, and this is what I want to do right now.
Right.
And let me just go with that and find meaning and purpose through that, right?
Okay.
Now, a lot of people, unfortunately, get stuck doing things that they don't find meaning and purpose in. Mm. And they sometimes do it very well. And then they'll say, well, I do that, but is that really what makes me tick? What really makes me, there's that big question, if you had all the money in the world, what would you do? Exactly. Right? And I love questions like that because they make us think about things without doing, but just thinking about the feeling behind it, which drives so much of what we do and drives our feeling of contentment, right? I don't always use the word happiness, but I say, let's start with contentment, mm-hmm. and work up with that scale.
Right. Okay. So the takeaway would be, just to sum it up a little, and we're going to get into that, is you look at purpose in phases. You're not looking for like a life purpose, like overwhelming yourself to finding a life purpose that's going to be there for years, but maybe for this stage in life. So take it sort of in stages, is what you're saying?
Exactly. Okay. Exactly. Okay. What is it for you right now?
Okay.
And that's what you focus on more in the here and now, in the present phase of your life.
Okay. So we spoke about this off air just like a few minutes ago, attention spans. And the thing is that I feel like that factors in with your life purpose. A lot of people have short attention spans now. They're impatient. They don't have the time or effort to put into finding a life purpose or spending some time alone to sort of like soul search and find answers. What's your take on that? I feel like it's affecting a lot of people. And we spoke about social media. We spoke about content on social media, how it needs to be like snappy and quick, and short captions, catchy, videos, and more than a minute you've lost your audience kind of thing. So what's your take on that?
Yeah. I mean, look, I think that on some level it's a little bit scary, mm-hmm. but I think we need to look at why it's happening. There's a lot of people and situations that are competing for our attention these days, right? And one of the things that I do in the retreats that I run is to talk about and look at conscious consumption, which is just exactly that, slowing down and asking, is this a need or a want? Is this what I envisioned I would actually need, or am I just going with a herd? Am I kind of falling for advertising tricks and things like that? But in general, there's a lot of things and people that are vying for our attention. And so in some ways, this could be adaptive, right? So it's a way to just quickly filter out where you want to focus your attention. But I think that it shouldn't, and I hope that it will not replace the need for going deeper into an issue and going deeper into a subject. It is true that short bites of information are easier for the brain to process and digest, right? So we often teach, break it down before it breaks you down. Don't try to eat the whole meal at once. Just from an optimization perspective, how do you do it? But at the same time, I think that should be more of a way to scan your interest and then pick the ones that you want to spend a little more time on and eventually go deeper, because this isn't a replacement for mastery. We have to still be able to look at mastering a skill and being able to do something well enough for change or just for what that skill requires.
Right.
But I just thought of an advantage. Very often I'll have a student at the schools that I'm affiliated with at Fortis Education. So it's San Mark and Regent, and just this morning we did a great class on peak performance and helping children with procrastination and things like that.
Okay.
But the students are so well informed because they're on TikTok and they're giving me all these, neuropsych terms about what they know. And I love it. And they know it.
Yes.
It's not just, because they watched a short clip on neuroplasticity and they asked me, do you know, miss, that, this, if you practice something this many times, you actually develop that. And that motivates them to keep going, because sometimes it's very hard to make sense of what you're doing in school, right?
Right.
And it's the same in the clinic and the practice. When I have a client come in, very often, sometimes it's a bit of self-diagnosis and we have to slow it down and say, well, I don't know if I agree with that.
Yeah, exactly.
But very often it's great because they're coming in with information and they help with the process of just looking at what's happening with them psychologically and from a relationship perspective, because they've just got that little bite.
Right. And it's nice that you said, like this self-diagnosis. At least they're doing something to try to find answers. So it's, in a way, it is kind of reassuring that the client or the patient is coming in, with an open mind and, someone that's been trying to do some research, trying to get better. So as much as it sometimes is frustrating because you feel like, well, I don't agree with the diagnosis, but at the same time you feel like, okay, well, at least they've been trying to find, a way to get better, or a definition or meaning to how they feel.
Yeah, there's some introspection, which is better than denial, because that's a lot harder to work with.
At least they notice that there's something that needs to be fixed, or not even fixed, but needs to be addressed, let's say.
Yeah.
Okay, you mentioned relationships, and that's a really nice segue into what we want to focus on. You deal with a lot of married couples with families, and I think this is crucial at this day and age. And again, it has to do with social media, with attention spans, with patience, with a lot of things that have sort of evolved and affected people, I want to say negatively, especially in their relationships these days, that they don't actually want to put in the work to salvage whatever's left of the relationship. We have a lot of listeners' questions actually in that area. So we put out like a short Instagram, poll and question just to get people to send in their questions and their responses and, what they want to know more about. But before we get into that, I want to know like what your approach is with married couples or with families, couples with kids.
Yeah, it's a good question. And there's good news. The good news is that I'm seeing a lot more pre-marriage couples.
Yes.
So young couples coming in and saying, we heard that you teach this premarital counseling course, and, what's that about?
Yes.
And I used to say, well, did somebody tell you to come in? Did like a mom or a dad or a friend or an uncle say, or a doctor say, look, no, we just heard that you do this, and, we think that it's good for us.
Okay.
So I said, okay, great, let's get going, right? And they're coming in, sometimes even before an engagement. And they'll say, look, our parents are completely fine with us, getting married. Our families are okay with it. And we want this, but we still think that we need to do the education piece.
Okay.
And that's like music to my ears because, prevention is everything, right? And so if we can teach skills, and relationship skills are exactly that, like tennis skills, if we can look at it like that and get started with that, it's magical, because then when you learn those skills out of conflict, then you're much better to apply them in conflict.
Right.
But if a couple's been in conflict for many years and then they come in and I'm trying to teach them the skills, it's a lot more difficult. And sometimes even impossible. I don't use that word very often, but sometimes it's impossible because they're just so fixed in their pain that they don't want to look at it from the other person's perspective.
Right.
So I do a lot of, I kind of mix up my couples and family work with non-directive, sort of open discussions about values and expectations and things like that. But I also mix it in with a lot of academic reading and research-based information from my favorite are John and Julie Gottman from the Gottman Institute, who have an assessment that I love. So I usually get my couples to do an assessment, so at least we know what we need to focus on and where to start. Because otherwise you can talk endlessly, right? And that's not always helpful. You can actually reinforce a lot of problems if you're not trained in the couple dynamic and you don't have information from both people. So, the danger of the single story, one side of the story, is massive. Right. And it's very dangerous to sometimes you just take in one side and not give airspace to the other side, because then you don't have a balanced view.
Right.
But I usually approach it like that.
It's funny that you mentioned the pre-marriage course, because my husband and I did that twice before we got married. We were so interested. We really wanted to, obviously we knew each other, but when you do the course and when you're put on the spot and asked certain questions, you really get to know the person. And I loved learning about how to have crucial conversations, how to have an argument. That was something that was such an eye-opener to me, because I felt like, well, you just argue. I mean, what's so difficult about arguing? You just yell and you argue. But there were things that we learned that to this day, we're not perfect. We don't do it 100% of the time, but there are times where we remember it and we think, okay, let's take a step back and let's apply what we've learned. And it makes it so much easier. And I feel like a lot of people, had they known that before they got into the marriage, or if they do actually make the effort to learn it after the marriage, it would make their lives easier. I just feel like it's just a matter of educating yourself with the right ways and the right methods and the right approach, I guess. And I feel this is actually one of the questions that we had, and I'm going to ask it now because I was in that situation before we took the course. This girl texted in. She's like, we're about to get married and everyone is scaring us from that first year of marriage. I feel like it's going to be one of the worst years of my life. Is it true? And I was put in that situation. Everyone was like, oh, your first year of marriage, it's the toughest. You know why? Because you're used to putting your slippers there and he puts it that way. And, you want this side of the bed and you use your toothpaste a certain way and he squeezes it from the middle. These silly things. They're like, oh, it's going to be the worst, but you just have to power through. And it was frightening. And I think that's why we did the course twice, because we felt like, no, we don't want it to be the worst year of our lives. We want it to be pleasant. Even if it's not the best, there is getting used to, like with your first year, but you do want it to be a pleasant experience. So I actually wanted to address that question since you mentioned it as well.
Yeah. Ooh, people can really instill the fear of God
Seriously,
in you, right?
Seriously.
And it's important to ask where that can come from. Often it comes from projection, right? So that might have been their experience.
Right.
They project that onto a couple and about to be married or engaged couple, and they just kind of want to I'm sure they're well-intentioned and say, look, watch out for these things. But no, it doesn't always have to be like that, right? And so, awareness is a big part of this. But I also think we're beyond just awareness and just talking. Now it's time to take action.
Right.
Now it should be just as, I joke with my children. I say dental every 6 months, mental every 6 months.
Oh, nice.
Cover yourself, dental, mental.
Nice.
Do something for your teeth and do something for your mind.
Nice.
And by teeth, I mean the whole body and just the physical, the representation of that. Instead of waiting for a problem and then trying to figure out what to do. But if you just keep up with the prevention, which is learning, action, not just awareness, but actual action where you go, okay, what are we going to do? How are we going to commit to this? What book are we reading together? What movies, or shows can we watch together? Who can we see on a monthly or every 3 months or however often we need to figure out what this relationship needs, because it's going to be completely different for every two people, because that little chemical reaction is going to depend on your family of origin and the rules that you learned about relationships. And sometimes it's true that it shifts pretty quickly from dating or from the time that you met to being married, because the level of commitment changes, and sometimes with that the expectation does change. So that's not entirely false to say that you can slip into that new environment and then a whole bunch of things just keep coming up. Sometimes, but not always. Sometimes the first year is the honeymoon, where things are really, really nice and easy and wonderful, and then things settle a little bit and the expectation starts to change or uncover itself a little bit more.
Right. Okay. So we're going to dive into the rest of the questions, and then we will get back to the listeners' questions. But we know that a lot of challenges can begin with the first child in a marriage or in a relationship. And I think it's very tough on both the male and the female. A lot of people focus on the females, and I think it's unfair. I give females the credit. I mean, women go through postpartum depression. They go through a lot of hormonal changes, physical changes, and the lack of sleep. I mean, it is a lot. It's very taxing on the woman, but it's also very exhausting, and it's very stressful for the man as well. So I want to just discuss that. I know we can't discuss it briefly, obviously, and it's a big topic, but I want to address that.
Yeah, that's true. And I think culturally we need to think about why in some cultures it's okay to talk about the male partner going through what they're going through, and in some cultures it's not.
Yes.
Do you know what I mean? So, but absolutely. I mean, with my clients and even just with family and friends, when I speak to them, it's the level of responsibility that males often feel is just supercharged from one day to the next, and that brings so much with it. And then depending on the personality, whether they internalize that stress or can talk about it or do something about it, will dictate how they move through it versus get stuck with it and be bound down by it, right? So it is as a transition. I think the first difficult transition usually is going from being a single individual to now being a couple. Right. And with every transition, there's a risk of a crisis. It doesn't have to be a crisis, but there's a risk of a crisis. And then the next transition that has a risk is going from a 2-person family unit or couple to a 3-person. And yes, it's true that the focus changes and it does become a lot more baby focused, because these cute little things take up your whole day and your whole night. But I always encourage couples to just find that little time to go back and just delegate as much as they can, so that they can get little pockets of time where you find attachment and connection again. Because otherwise, you're right, what ends up happening is a lot of new parents end up with what they think is a temporary parallel life. Okay, I'll do what I need to do and you do what you need to do, and at some point we'll find the bridge and then we'll cross the bridge and we'll meet again. But sometimes that doesn't happen because a baby will need all this time, but then a toddler needs time, and then a child, and then you usually by then it's 2, 3, 4, and it's never ending. So the commitment is important pre transition to say, look, we're going to try and commit to some of these things that are useful for both of us. And there's some baby transition work that I do as well with new parents, also based on the Gottman's research.
Okay.
There's a very nice program called And Baby Makes Three, or Bringing Baby Home. The book is called Baby Makes Three, but the course is called Bringing Baby Home. And it's lovely because it's just how to deal with those feelings. And it often, most couples will say, I knew most of that, but it's just given me permission to feel it. And it's given me permission now to ask for what I want when I need it, because I can see that it's okay.
Okay. And in, families or like family units that come to you, basically, do you deal with children?
I do deal with children. Yeah.
Okay. And is that challenging? Do you feel like children are more challenging than adults when...
In most cases, it's usually not the child that needs very much.
Really?
Yes.
Okay, interesting. Why do you say that?
Children are often scapegoats for the problem.
Right.
They're the presenting person with the problem, or the presenting problem. And every so often I'll have a couple or a family or a parent say, happy to drop Johnny off and I'll pick them up in an hour and just do what you can, please, and tell me what I need to do, and let's just take it from there. And they're very well intentioned, and but we'll start with that, but just keep it brief. And then usually I'm more interested in what's happening in this family unit or for this parent that is bringing this child in. And I'm not saying that children don't need to learn self-regulation techniques and a lot of other things that can come with even sort of current stressors. I think that that does happen.
Right.
But do they need to be in focus? No. It's the family system that I think needs the focus, and children just need a little support along the way. Yeah.
Okay. So you feel like a lot of the root causes of why the child is there goes back to the family unit or the parents.
Very often.
Okay.
And if it's something that's developmental, or if it's something that is specific to the child, then the work still goes back to the parents.
Okay.
So when I say I see children, yes, I do. We do an assessment, we make a plan, but then actually the work happens through the unit versus just the child.
Just the child.
Yeah.
Okay. This is something that I just thought of because I wish my parents just took me to someone to talk to as a child. I feel like a lot of people are doing that more and more now.
Yes.
Not necessarily because their child has an issue or a developmental, obstacle or challenge. They're probably just sending them through so that they can talk to someone that can make sense of how they feel, because sometimes parents are not equipped to do that. And I applaud parents that do that, because I feel like as a child, you deal with so much that your parents don't know about. So I spoke to this lovely guest that came on the show who deals with women's health, and she was talking about how, down to the simplest thing, when a girl gets her first period, or when she goes through puberty, or when a boy goes through puberty, these things are sort of kept in, and you don't speak to your parents about them, or your parents don't speak to you about them. And I would have wished that someone would have just taken me to someone to talk about it and just get it off my chest. Things would have been so much easier. Do you get clients like that? Do you get people that just bring in their child? There is no issue, but they just want someone to talk to.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And I like you, I sort of applaud that approach and that openness as well. I think it's very helpful now that schools have counselors and that children have permission, and the whole school system is built around allowing children and just not just facilitating, but actually encouraging them to reach out to somebody in a safe environment. And school, it can be a safe environment, a counselor, an external counselor. But I add to that as well to say that very often children need and wish for, because when they come to me, this is what I hear very often as well. It's not always, I just need someone to speak to. That's true. But that person can be a parent. So it's nice to have a supplement, right, in the form of an external person. But very often what I hear from the children who come in to me is that if I had more time with my parents, and then I take that back to mom and dad, and I'll say, can we try and create just maybe extensions in the pockets of time that you have together, because you'll see that maybe it'll be easier for them to share what they're sharing with me with you.
Right.
And that doesn't mean that we don't still see each other periodically for things, especially if there's nothing, critical happening, if there's no crisis.
Right.
But I see that in my family as well, that when I'm spending longer with my children, they'll tell me things that if the week's been busy, they'll say things just because now we had an extended period of time together. That you can't replace that. You can't rush it.
Right.
There's no other substitute for spending that time together. And not always in activity, not always directed towards a lesson or a show or, a class or something, but just hanging out and doing absolutely nothing is when I hear things that I don't expect to hear.
Exactly. Exactly. When you've given them your full time and attention is when you really, truly connect with them, I guess.